I'd like to thank the conference organizers for including me in this conference. And just to give a background, I'm a professor of political science and gender and women's studies from University of Wisconsin in the States. But this year, I'm spending the whole year in Morocco at Al Ahwain University, and I'm teaching there and doing research on the topic that I'm going to talk about. As a caveat, I should just say that this is the beginning of a project, so I'm giving you my initial reflections. And I really appreciated Professor Grami's perspective because it's a nice counterpoint to what I'm talking about. I'm taking a step back and situating some of the trends in the Maghreb in a broader global context and a broader regional context. My own background is in sub-Saharan African politics. I look at women in politics in sub-Saharan Africa and look at women's movements. So that's where I'm coming from, and so it'll be an interesting discussion. Some of the new developments that we're seeing in the MENA region, especially in the Maghreb, in Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria, are challenging existing scholarship, especially Western scholarship on the MENA region, and claims about women's political representation and legal reform in the Middle East and globally as well. Much of the focus of existing research to date has looked at individual country studies, which is limited in terms of generalizability, although extremely useful. Or it's consisted of very broad cross-national global statistical research that's so general that one loses the particular historical, cultural, and regional specificities of this region. So I think that at the regional level, we can begin to see some important trends that aren't entirely captured by either level of analysis. And for many years, Tunisia was seen as a country that led the region in women's rights. But today, I think there's more of a convergence with advances in women's rights that are evident in Morocco and Algeria as well, particularly when it comes to the adoption of legislative quotas and the changes in the personal status code. These struggles are not over, as we heard. They're maybe just beginning, but we're beginning to see a trend here that I'd like to point to. So the question that I'm trying to answer is, why has the Maghreb made faster reforms in women's rights and representation than other MENA countries? That's the overarching question. And if you look at most measures, this is a complicated table, but just to break it down a little bit, you can see that there's a difference between the Maghreb countries and the other MENA countries when it comes to the family code. And here I'm looking at the SIGI index, which looks at norms and laws and practices. So the women's status in the household and the family, age of marriage, early marriage, parental authority, and inheritance. If you look at there's a difference between the Maghreb and the rest of the MENA in terms of physical integrity, which looks at violence against women, laws on sexual harassment, attitudes towards violence, prevalence of violence. There's no difference when it comes to questions of resources and assets, which should be of interest and a curiosity for this group. Access to land and non-land assets, access to financial services, there's no difference. When it comes to civil liberties, access to public space, political voice, political representation, here again you see a difference. So if you look at a whole series of measures, the Maghreb countries look different, are beginning to look different, let's put it that way, than other MENA countries. Recently there's been debates around nationality laws in many countries in the MENA region, and the push to allow children to inherit nationality of their mother if it's different than that of the father. Right now in Morocco there's a big debate around extending that nationality right to husbands as well. But again, you can see that it's the Maghreb countries and then almost none of the other countries that have adopted those laws. Mm-hmm. Perhaps the clearest difference is when it comes to political representation. Women today hold 27% of the seats, legislative seats in the Maghreb, compared with 10% in the rest of the MENA region. And again, it's higher than the global 22%. It's higher than the United States. We have only 20% women in the parliament. And so, again, you see the pattern quite clearly there. And again, it doesn't mean that there's no issues here, but just that this is the broader picture. So many people have talked about the commonalities of the Maghreb countries, the fact that they have this Arab Islamic Amazigh French legacy, French colonial legacy. In their jurisprudence, you have both the Maliki Islamic and French jurisprudence. You also have a centralized state control over the legal system. And so at the time of independence, from France, they could either follow the French model of codified law that was enacted by the state, or a system of decentralized jurist law, where the control over the formulation of laws would have gone to religious scholars. And all three states chose the French model, which maximized the possibility of centralized state control over the legal system. And all three systems also rejected the traditional Islamic model of separate, confessionally based family laws, and they adjusted their personal status laws to enable them to apply them to non-Muslims. You have the state control over family law, but it still is, and this is an important caveat, it still is interpreted with reference to Islamic jurisprudence, even in Tunisia. So there's a lot of emphasis on the commonalities, but in fact, if you look at these countries, they're quite different. And here you can see that Tunisia had a more centralized state than Algeria and Morocco. Tunisia had a history of more secular legislation in general. Algeria was colonized much, much longer than the other two countries. Algeria has a strong post-war legacy, both with the War of Independence, but then also the more recent war between 1991 and 2002, but it ended earlier than that. Morocco and Tunisia were protectorates of France. Algeria was colonized and had a large settler population, a very large one. Morocco was not part of the Ottoman Empire, which has implications for law. Morocco was a monarchy, the other two are not. Morocco is not part of the African Union, which has implications for women's rights because of the Maputo Declaration, which we can talk about later. And of the three countries, only Tunisia is really considered a democracy. So I think that the differences perhaps outweigh the similarities in many ways, although the similarities are important. Munira Charad has highlighted these differences between the countries and the implications for women's rights. She talks about how she wants to explain why Tunisia was so different than the other two countries and why it made more dramatic reforms for women, with Bourguiba introducing the personal status code in 1956, which put the family structure on a legal equality footing. He abolished polygamy, introduced legal divorce, set the legal age for marriage, granted women the right to work and to gain an education, and so on. And so in explaining these changes in Tunisia, she highlights the fact that Tunisian state emerged autonomous from kin groups, whereas in Algeria and Morocco, the tribal structures were much more tied to the state, and this has to do with the French legacy. So we're talking now about, in spite of all these differences between these countries, we're now seeing a convergence in laws on the legal front in all three countries. The countries are not identical by any means, but they're somehow moving in the same direction compared to other countries. And so if you look, for example, at some of the reforms that have taken place, you have major constitutional changes in all three countries. You have major reforms in the personal status code that the debates are far from over. Right now there's a debate going on in Morocco around inheritance law and making that more equal. But at least there have been major changes that were quite significant. Algeria's personal status code is still, people are very unhappy with it, but it's a start. You had changes in sexual harassment laws in recent years. You've had changes in the nationality laws that I just mentioned. You had quota laws that were changed in all three countries. And recently, violence against women legislation. Again, these are all, the violence against women, these are they're all they're different. They're in nature. In Morocco, they amended an article of the Penal Code that had allowed rapists of underage girls to avoid prosecution by marrying their victims. So that was a change. The Algerian law was to criminalize domestic violence. And Tunisia is right now in the process of working on a law on violence against women. You also have women in the legal profession, quite prominent. In Tunisia, women make up 27% of the judges and 31% of the lawyers. This is a new president of the Association of Young Lawyers, who's a woman. You have, in Algeria, women make up 70% of the country's lawyers and 60% of the judges. I don't have the figures the figures I have for Morocco are 1998, and I think they're just too old to use. Okay, so how does this challenge existing theories? Well, I'll throw out a few that are quite popular, at least in the West. One is one that ties some of the representation of women in MENA countries to oil rents. Michael Ross has argued that oil production negatively influences women's representation because the oil rents reduce the number of women in the workforce and hence their capacity to mount pressures for change. But the fact that now we're seeing larger and larger numbers of women coming into political representation, into legislatures, in a way challenges this, and it suggests that Ross doesn't account enough for the use of quotas as a mechanism to get women into political power, and it also does not account for women's mobilization to get those quotas passed. So if you look at what's happening in the MENA countries, you now have a very little difference between oil producers and non-oil producers. There's 13% women in legislation for oil producers and 14% for non-oil producers. And Alice Kong has done a study that's looked at this globally, and again, when you put quotas into the model, the oil rents fall out and don't have an impact. Another major approach that you hear in the West, at least, and this is one that's perhaps the most dominant approach or explanation, is cultural attitudes and religion. These are two leading, Ron Inglehart and Pippa Norris are two leading political scientists, and they claim that religiosity, and in particular Islam, the Islamic religious heritage is one of the most powerful barriers to the rising tide of gender equality. But again, it's not looking at some of the changes with the adoption of quotas. They're not looking at, obviously they couldn't have looked at what's happened in the Maghreb, but here we see, if you look at the numbers, it seems that increasingly it's a question of other factors, political will and quotas and institutional factors. But if you do look at the attitudes, this is from Arab Barometer. I don't know if you know it. I heard that people citing world values, but people who work on political science at least are tending to use the Arab Barometer more now. It's started in 2006, and they've done 14 countries in three rounds. And they have people from the region who are on the board and who are designing the questions, and so I think it's taken as perhaps more authoritative than world values in some respects. But they ask many of the same questions that world values looks at. So, in terms of these measures of religiosity, there is a difference between the Maghreb countries and the MENA countries. They are, people are self-reporting to be less religious. So one might make the argument. But then if you start looking at issues like representation of women, you see that there isn't a huge difference between, in Africa at least, and this is my African, sub-Saharan Africa background, but I've looked at if you include both North and South, sub-Saharan Africa, and look overall at Muslim countries, there isn't a huge difference between them and non-Muslim countries when it comes to representation of women in parliament. Senegal has 43% women in parliament, and it's a predominantly 99.9% Muslim country. So it can't be, religion can matter, but it can't matter that much. at least if you look at the trends. And the same thing if you look at it globally. When Alice Kong and myself looked at this cross-nationally, and you put quotas into the models, again, the proportion of the population being Muslim no longer influences legislative representation of women negatively. It's not, and that's because so many Muslim countries have adopted quotas. And again, in the case of Senegal, it was the women's movement that pushed for quotas in that country, and they got them, and this has been the outcome. So I think that this supports that these numbers help us understand that it's not that attitudes are not important or religiosity is not important, but it's just that it's not the whole story, the way that many of the people who have written about this have argued. You can look at also at attitudes. I mean, there is a difference between the MENA countries and the Maghreb countries and the MENA countries when it comes to democracy, attitudes towards democracy and support for democracy. So it does matter. But at the same time, if you look at quotas were adopted, or many of the reforms were adopted under Ben Ali and Bourguiba, and they were authoritarian. So again, attitudes matter, but up to a point, especially in a country that's authoritarian. If you look at attitudes towards gender equality, it's a very mixed bag between the Maghreb and the MENA countries. On some measures, such as gender equality in the Constitution and married women can work outside the home, you actually have less support among the Maghreb countries. On the other two measures, less support for gender equality. On the other two measures, you have more support. Men should be are better as political leaders. They disagreed more with that in the Maghreb countries. They also disagreed with the idea that university education is more important for boys. So again, it's mixed, the opinions around gender equality that have been surveyed. Okay. So, what does matter then? Well, like I've been hinting at, political will, the adoption of quotas, women's movements that have pushed for the adoption of quotas have made a big difference. And so the MENA countries that have adopted quotas have 4 times higher representation of women in legislatures than countries that have not adopted quotas. And there are different kinds of quotas. I don't probably need to get into great detail on this, but you have different mechanisms and different ways in which these quotas have been adopted. Some countries have appointed quotas, Bahrain, Oman, Saudi Arabia. Some countries, 6 countries, have legislative quotas where there's a law that has been passed that all parties have to abide by. 4 countries have reserved seats, and some countries, like Turkey, have voluntary quotas that parties themselves have adopted. Okay, one more argument that's out there, and that is the notion that having a unified legal system makes a difference. Rania Maktabi and Dörte Engelek have argued that the more unified the legal system, the more likely you are to see gender reform. Engelek also ties it to the different British and French traditions, the French tradition being supporting more of a unified court system. I think it's a necessary condition, but it's sufficient, but not, wait, I gotta get this right now. What is it? Necessary, but it's not sufficient, right. So it's obviously the countries that have had unified courts, and I think it's also important to separate unified laws because some countries have just the unified courts, but then the court will rule differently according to your religious affiliation. So if you have both unified courts and unified laws, yes, it matters. But obviously there's a lot of variation there. And so if you look at it comparatively, I'm not sure that it's such a convincing, it's the only thing that one has to, that would explain the difference between the Maghreb countries and the others. Okay, so what does explain it? And this is the piece that I need your help with, perhaps more than anything. I think to some extent, it's a combination of factors. So to some extent, it has to do with democratization. And so if you look at the Maghreb countries and you compare them with the other MENA countries, you can see that on political rights, civil liberties, and the overall democracy, they've inched, they've moved in the past 10 years. And this is comparing the years 2005 to 2015. And the rest of the MENA countries have stagnated. There were no other countries that had moved like that. And so they've gone backwards and stagnated. If you look at press freedom, you see the same. There's been an overall improvement in the Maghreb countries, and it's worsened a little bit in the other MENA countries. So democracy is part of the story. And democracy matters because it opens up political space. It opens up, you have a very vibrant women's movement in Morocco. We saw the movement around constitution in Tunisia. You have women's movements, and you have civil society organizations and human rights organizations that are pressing for changes, even if constrained. And in Morocco, this happened at the time that Mohammed VI came into office. And in Tunisia, we saw the women's movement energized by the debates over the constitution. Also, to a certain extent, and I don't want to make it too big a point on this, but in some areas, because there's been such huge battles between feminists and secularists and then Islamists, and especially the Salafists, but at certain moments, at certain times, there has been a convergence around specific issues. No one's ever been completely happy. Okay, but there's been accommodations around the quota issue, for example, and in the Moroccan case, and in fact it was the Moroccan Justice and Development Party that benefited the most from the quotas. They got the largest number of elected women, 16 that came into Parliament. Then you have the diffusion of international pressures and diffusion of ideas. UN agencies have often been very instrumental in working with women's coalitions. And here I just put this picture in. I threw it in at the last minute. I'm not sure if I should have done that, but anyway, it was just before I came here, I was teaching a class, and I brought in 3 women from the cooperative movement in the nearby area around Ifran. And one of them had commented. One makes those buttons on the jalaba, the golden. Her organization's called the Golden Button Cooperative, and then the other one works with herbs and honey, and sells those. And then the third one worked with was Golden Fingers, and they are weavers. And they make these beautiful, beautiful, fantastic carpets. Anyway, but her comment was that the global concern with women's economic participation and having more laws to protect them has made a real difference to their economic lives. Without the global context of support for women, we would not be here today. And then the other woman in the white said that it was the King and the World Bank's National Human Development Initiative that had helped them. So, I mean, you get a sense that even at the very, very grassroots, and this is kind of just a sliver of evidence, but that the international environment also makes a difference, and support for their activities matters. And then finally, in the Algerian case, and I can say more about this in the question and answer, but in recent, not the earlier conflicts, but after the 2000s in particular, in Africa there have been 17 conflicts that have come to an end, and Algeria is one of them. And you've seen after that an increase in women's representation. So the countries that have come out of conflict have much higher rates of women in parliament. You see many more laws being passed, many more constitutional changes. I just wrote a book about that. It's coming out with Cambridge any day now, this month. And so I think that Algeria fits that particular model. So just to conclude, since my time is really, really up, I think, and again, we can talk about it, but I think that you have a little bit of political opening, active coalitions involving women's organizations, civil society, and political parties, UN organizations, and other international actors. You have some diffusion and learning between countries, and the pursuit of some accommodations, however problematic and unstable. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.